It was the start of summer in Oakwood Hills, a neighborhood that prided itself on being picturesque, orderly, and governed by a homeowners association that seemed to care about every blade of grass and every coat of paint. Families who lived there paid their dues, followed the rules, and often competed silently to see whose yard looked the most manicured or whose holiday decorations won the HOA as seasonal recognition dot at the end of Cedar Lane set the Parker family's house. Newly built, with clean lines and a spacious backyard, it had one feature that quickly became the envy of the neighborhood: a shimmering in-ground swimming pool. It wasn't just a pool, though it was the kind of backyard oasis that homeowners dreamed about. Palm trees framed the water, soft lights lined the edges, and a waterfall feature spilled gracefully into the deep end. To the Parkers, the pool was more than just a luxury. It was a long-awaited dream, something they had saved for years to afford. Their children splashed in it daily, and neighbors with young kids often gathered on weekends to share in the fun. It quickly became the heartbeat of Cedar Lane, drawing in laughter, splashing, and the kind of memories that make summer feel timeless. But not everyone saw it that way. Across the street, behind her neatly trimmed hedges and ever-watchful eyes, lived Marjorie Klein, though everyone simply referred to her as Karen. She was the kind of neighbor who could spot a garbage can placed 2 inches too far from the curb, or a lawn that had been mowed a day later than HOA guidelines suggested. She didn't just live by the rules. She weaponized them, and to her, the Parker family's pool was nothing short of an abomination. At first, her objections were disguised as concern. She whispered to passing neighbors about excessive noise, though the pool parties usually ended by dusk. She complained of unsightly pool equipment, even though the Parkers had installed a privacy fence that exceeded code requirements. And she brought up safety hazards as if every splash carried the potential for catastrophe. But beneath those surface-level complaints lay something deeper, something she hadn't yet revealed. The first official complaint came in June, just a week after the Parkers hosted a barbecue and invited half the cul-de-sac. Karen filed a noise violation with the HOA, citing disturbance of peace. When the HOA president, a weary man named Douglas, arrived to investigate, he found children playing Marco Polo, parents chatting quietly around the grill, and music playing at a moderate volume. He gave the Parkers a warning but admitted it was more of a formality than anything else. Still, Karen wasn't satisfied. Her second complaint came just days later, this time about unauthorized construction. She argued that the pool's waterfall feature hadn't been included in the original plans filed with the HOA. Once again, Douglas had to review documents, only to find that the Parkers had followed every procedure to the letter. With each failed attempt to punish them, Karen's frustration grew. She sat in her front window, peering through lace curtains, waiting for the smallest slip-up she could report. If a pool toy floated into her yard, she claimed it was littering. If a guest parked on the street, she declared it was a violation of traffic safety. She called the HOA, animal control, and even the police on one occasion, citing unruly disturbances. Each time, her complaints collapsed under scrutiny, yet Karen was relentless. The breaking point for the Parkers came in mid-July, when they organized a pool party for their daughter's 12th birthday. The sun was hot, the air filled with the scent of grilled burgers, and laughter spilled from the backyard as more than 20 children splashed in the sparkling water. Parents gathered in lawn chairs, chatting and sipping iced tea, enjoying what had become a rare moment of pure neighborhood unity. From across the street, Karen watched with mounting fury. She dialed the HOA office 3 separate times that afternoon, insisting the Parkers were violating noise ordinances and overcrowding rules. When she didn't get the response she wanted, she escalated further, calling the local police department to report a massive disturbance and alleging safety risks to children. The police arrived mid-afternoon, their flashing lights drawing confused stares from parents and children alike. When the officers entered the backyard, they found nothing more than happy kids, responsible adults, and a party that followed every law. They issued no citations, but the damage was done, the party's mood soured, the children unsettled, the parents whispering about Karen's latest stunt, and still, she wasn't finished. That evening, Karen appeared at the next emergency HOA meeting, armed with a binder of printed complaints, photographs taken from her window, and a determination that bordered on obsession. She insisted that the Parkers' pool had turned Cedar Lane into a rowdy circus, destroying the neighborhood's peace and property values. She demanded immediate fines, sanctions, and even suggested the pool be filled in if the Parkers couldn't comply with her demands. For the first time, though, Karen faced resistance not just from the Parkers, but from the HOA board itself. Some members, tired of her constant grievances, began to question her motives. Why was she so determined to destroy the Parkers' joy? Why was she so invested in shutting down something that brought the rest of the community together? But Karen wasn't prepared to answer those questions. Not yet. Instead, she doubled down, threatening legal action and spreading rumors through whispered conversations at every corner of the neighborhood. She painted the Parkers as reckless, inconsiderate, and defiant of community standards. She planted seeds of doubt among some neighbors, but in doing so, she also exposed herself as the true source of discord. What Karen didn't realize was that her crusade against the Parkers had awakened something in the community: suspicion. Neighbors began quietly comparing notes, piecing together her tactics, and wondering what fueled her obsession. And the truth, once revealed, would shake the entire HOA to its core. But for now, the war was just beginning. The Parkers had endured complaint after complaint, but they were determined not to let Karen win. What started as a dream pool had turned into the center of a neighborhood battle, and the lines were being drawn. On one side stood Karen, armed with pettiness and persistence. On the other stood a family and a growing number of neighbors, united by frustration and the simple desire to live in peace. The summer that had begun with laughter and splashing water was turning into something else entirely: a test of wills, a battle of patience, and a fight that would reveal secrets no one in Oakwood Hills expected. And as July stretched into August, Karen was about to make her boldest move yet. The aftermath of the birthday pool party lingered long after the last balloons had deflated and had faded. Leftover cake had been eaten. The Parkers thought the worst was behind them, that Karen's stunt of calling the police would be her final act of interference. But they underestimated her persistence. For Karen, the pool had become an obsession, and every splash of water felt like a personal insult. The very next morning, she was outside with a camera in hand, snapping photos of the Parkers' backyard from across the street. She zoomed in on inflatable floats, on guests' cars parked neatly along the curb, and even on children's towels drying on the fence. Each photo was carefully documented and filed away in the binder she kept tucked under her arm like a weapon. By the end of the week, she had submitted an 18-page complaint to the HOA board. She listed alleged noise violations, claimed the Parkers were hosting commercial gatherings, and even accused them of endangering children by allowing unregulated swimming. Binder was heavy with evidence, at least in Karen's eyes. HOA board, however, was less convinced. They had dealt with Karen before. Her name appeared on nearly every monthly agenda, her complaints ranging from lawn heights to mailbox paint colors. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just annoyed, she was determined to eliminate the pool. And her determination was starting to strain the patience of even the most rule-abiding board members. Still, the rules were the rules. The board issued the Parkers a notice to attend a formal hearing, forcing them to defend themselves against Karen's laundry list of accusations. The notice itself was humiliating, pinned to their front door for the whole cul-de-sac to see. Neighbors whispered as they walked by, some offering sympathetic glances, others silently wondering how far Karen was willing to go. The hearing became the talk of the neighborhood. On the evening it was held, the small HOA office filled with more residents than usual, many curious to see how the drama would unfold. Karen arrived first, binder in hand, her expression sharp with confidence. She positioned herself at the front of the room, eager to unleash her evidence like a prosecutor preparing for trial. When the Parkers arrived, their quiet demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's theatrical presence. They carried only a small folder of documents, permits, inspection records, and HOA approvals that showed every step of their pool installation had been above board. Where Karen came armed with photographs of towels and water toys, the Parkers brought facts. The board listened patiently as Karen presented her case. She flipped through page after page of photographs, raising her voice as she described the supposed chaos of pool parties. She cited obscure bylaws, stretched interpretations of regulations, and even speculated about declining property values if the pool remained. Some board members nodded politely, but most sat in silence, their expressions betraying growing skepticism. When it was the Parkers' turn, they calmly explained how they had followed every requirement, how their parties were always respectful of noise curfews, and how every guest's car was legally parked. They provided permits that matched the HOA's own records, leaving little room for dispute. By the end of the hearing, it was clear who had presented a stronger case. The board voted unanimously in the Parkers' favor, dismissing every one of Karen's complaints. It was a public defeat, and for a woman who thrived on control, it was devastating. But Karen wasn't finished. If the HOA board wouldn't bend to her will, she would find another way. That evening, as neighbors walked home from the meeting, she stayed behind, cornering individual board members in hushed conversations. She reminded them of past favors, threatened to dig into their own compliance records, and hinted that failing to act against the Parkers might jeopardize their reputations. It was manipulation at its most desperate, and for the first time, people began to see through her. The community, once merely annoyed by her antics, started to view Karen differently. Parents whispered about how she had called the police to a child's birthday party. Families questioned why she spent so much time watching other people's backyards. And some began to suspect that her vendetta against the Parkers wasn't about noise, rules, or property values at all. Something else was fueling her fury. Meanwhile, the Parkers tried to move on. They hosted smaller gatherings, cautious not to attract attention, but it hardly mattered. Karen was always watching. If a single car was parked on the street, she took photos. If a child laughed too loudly, she wrote it down. Her obsession became the pulse of her life, and her neighbors noticed. By late July, Karen escalated further. She filed anonymous complaints with the city zoning office, claiming the pool had been built too close to the property line. She mailed letters to the local health department, alleging unsafe water conditions. She even left flyers in mailboxes warning of the dangers of unsupervised pools in family neighborhoods. Each move was more aggressive than the last, and each one was met with the same result: dismissal. But with every failed attempt, Karen grew more reckless. She stopped hiding behind rules and regulations and instead embraced outright harassment. She lingered outside the Parkers' home at night, photographing their yard under the glow of streetlights. She left voicemails on the HOA office line at all hours, demanding action. And when her binder of complaints grew too heavy to carry, she started a second one. The Parkers, though frustrated, weren't the only ones suffering. The entire neighborhood felt the ripple effects of Karen's crusade. The HOA board, drained by her constant demands, began delaying other community projects. Residents felt embarrassed when city inspectors showed up over false complaints. And the sense of unity that once defined Oakwood Hills began to fracture. It was no longer just a battle between Karen and the Parkers. It was a war that dragged the entire community into its orbit. And then, in early August, the tide began to shift. A neighbor on the next street over, tired of Karen's constant interference, decided to dig a little deeper. Through public records, they uncovered something startling. Karen had once applied for a pool permit herself years earlier and had been denied due to setbacks on her property line. Suddenly, her relentless campaign against the Parkers made sense. It wasn't about rules or peace or property values. It was jealousy. The Parkers had what she had wanted and failed to obtain, and she would stop at nothing to destroy it. Word spread quickly, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, until nearly everyone in Oakwood Hills knew the truth. What had once been seen as strictness or vigilance was now seen for what it really was: bitterness, envy, and obsession. And with the truth finally bubbling to the surface, the HOA's patience was running out. Karen had declared war on the Parkers, but now the neighborhood was preparing to declare war on her. By the time August rolled in, the summer heat was oppressive, and so was the tension in Oakwood Hills. The Parkers' pool, once a joyful centerpiece of neighborhood gatherings, now carried the weight of constant surveillance and hostility. Karen's crusade had cast a shadow over every splash, every laugh, and every late afternoon barbecue. But the discovery of her past, the pool permit she had once applied for and been denied, changed everything. Whispers of her failed application spread like wildfire, unraveling the narrative she had carefully constructed. For years, she had presented herself as the guardian of order, the protector of community values. Now neighbors saw her for what she really was, envious, bitter, and relentless in her pursuit of control. It began with small shifts in behavior. Parents who once nodded politely when Karen passed by began turning their heads, unwilling to entertain her complaints. Neighbors who used to tolerate her constant surveillance stopped responding to her thinly veiled questions. Even her closest allies, those who had once believed her claims of protecting property values, started questioning why she had such a personal vendetta against the Parkers. For Karen, the shift was imperceptible at first. She still roamed the streets with her binder, still snapped photographs of cars parked outside the Parkers' home, fired off complaints to the HOA and city offices. But now, instead of nods of agreement, she received looks of irritation. Instead of support, she met silence. And the silence was louder than any rejection she had ever faced. The HOA board, too, had reached its breaking point. Each meeting, once dedicated to community improvements, had been consumed by Karen's endless tirades. Budgets for landscaping, playground repairs, and street maintenance were stalled while the board sifted through stacks of her complaints. Even Douglas, the weary HOA president who had once tried to placate her, began voicing his frustration. The Parkers weren't the problem. Karen was. Neighbors began to rally quietly. Small conversations turned into shared frustrations, and frustrations turned into plans. Some suggested filing counter-complaints against Karen for harassment. Others floated the idea of removing her from the HOA altogether. And a few, more quietly, proposed exposing her behavior publicly, letting the wider community see the chaos she had created. The first sign of unity came during another weekend pool party. It wasn't as large as the birthday celebration, but it was enough to draw attention. Children laughed, parents chatted, and music played softly in the background. As expected, Karen appeared at the edge of her driveway, binder tucked under her arm, phone in hand. But this time, something unexpected happened. When Karen began photographing the cars lining the curb, a neighbor stepped outside, not from the Parkers' home, but from 2 houses down. He walked directly into her line of sight, blocking her camera with his body. Another neighbor followed, standing beside him, their arms crossed in silent defiance. Soon, 6 neighbors had gathered, creating a quiet but powerful barrier between Karen and her targets. For the first time, Karen was outnumbered. Her usual confidence faltered as she realized the community wasn't standing with her, they were standing against her. She retreated into her house, slamming the door, but the image lingered, a neighborhood united, refusing to let her ruin what little joy they had left. That small act of resistance grew into something bigger. Within days, residents began organizing. They drafted letters to the HOA board, not in support of Karen's complaints, but against them. They signed petitions demanding that the board address her harassment. They even began documenting her behavior, photos of her trespassing to measure fences, notes about her late-night prowling, and screenshots of the endless stream of complaints she sent. The tide had turned. Where Karen once wielded her binder like a weapon, the community now held evidence against her. The HOA board scheduled another special meeting, this time not to hear Karen's grievances, but to address her behavior. Word spread quickly, and nearly every household sent a representative. The small office was packed, residents standing shoulder to shoulder, murmuring with anticipation. The air was thick with tension as Karen walked in, still clutching her binder, her chin lifted high as if nothing had changed, but it had. When the meeting began, Douglas opened the floor not to Karen but to the community. One by one, residents stepped forward, recounting their experiences with her harassment. Parents described the humiliation of having police show up at their children's parties. Families spoke about inspectors knocking on their doors over false complaints. Neighbors detailed how their own projects had been delayed because Karen monopolized every board meeting with personal vendettas. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she clutched her binder. For years she had dominated these meetings, her voice the loudest in the room. But now her neighbors drowned her out with their collective frustration. And as each story unfolded, the board's patience visibly crumbled. By the time the last resident spoke, the decision was clear. The HOA board announced an investigation not into the Parkers, but into Karen. Her complaints would be suspended pending review. Her harassment of neighbors would be formally documented. and the possibility of removing her from the HOA entirely was now on the table. For Karen, it was a stunning blow. Her identity as the self-appointed enforcer of Oakwood Hills had been stripped away in a single meeting. She tried to protest, raising her voice, waving her binder as if it still carried authority. But the room, once silent when she spoke, now erupted in groans and whispers of disapproval. Her power was slipping, and she knew it. When she stormed out of the meeting, binder pressed tightly against her chest, she left behind more than just a room full of frustrated neighbors. She left behind her control, her influence, and the respect she had long claimed to command. But Karen wasn't one to surrender easily. In the days that followed, she retreated from public view, but her presence was still felt. Curtains twitched as she watched from her windows. Neighbors noticed her car parked outside the HOA office late at night, and rumors spread that she was planning something drastic, a final attempt to regain the power she had lost. The community had united against her, but unity alone wouldn't stop her obsession. Karen had been exposed, humiliated, and cornered. And when someone like her is cornered, they don't fade quietly into the background. They strike back. And Oakwood Hills was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. Karen's fall from grace was swift but not silent. After the explosive HOA meeting where the board suspended her complaints and launched an investigation into her behavior, she withdrew into her house. For days her blinds stayed half shut, her car rarely moved from the driveway, and the streets felt oddly calmer without her constant surveillance. But beneath the quiet exterior, Karen was plotting. She had spent years carving out an identity as the self-proclaimed enforcer of Oakwood Hills. To lose that authority so suddenly and so publicly was intolerable. Every whispered conversation she overheard from her porch, every dismissive glance from a neighbor, every child's laugh drifting from the Parkers' pool was like salt in an open wound. She couldn't let it end like this. Karen's obsession deepened. She doubled down on her late-night research, scouring HOA bylaws and local ordinances for anything she could twist into ammunition. She wrote long, rambling letters to city officials, alleging corruption within the HOA. She pored over property maps, convinced that somewhere, hidden in the fine print, was a loophole that would give her the power to strike back. The neighborhood began to notice her desperation. Residents whispered about the lights in her study burning past midnight. Delivery drivers mentioned the stacks of certified mail left at her doorstep each week. Some neighbors pitied her decline, while others grew wary. It was as if she had become a storm cloud hovering over Cedar Lane, unpredictable and dangerous. Then came her boldest move yet. One sweltering Saturday afternoon, just as the Parkers hosted a modest pool gathering, a city inspector arrived unannounced. Clipboard in hand, he explained that an anonymous tip had alleged structural issues with the pool that could endanger swimmers. Though the inspector found nothing unsafe, the surprise visit rattled the Parkers and infuriated their guests. Word spread quickly, and the community knew immediately who was behind it. Karen's fingerprints were all over the stunt, and this time, neighbors didn't stay silent. Several families banded together to file formal harassment reports, submitting documentation of her behavior, photos of her prowling at night, evidence of her constant complaints, and records of her false reports. The HOA board, already weary, began drafting a motion for sanctions, but Karen didn't back down. Instead, she escalated again. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, she crept across the street toward the Parkers' property. With a flashlight in hand, she examined the fence line, taking photographs and muttering to herself as if confirming her suspicions. What she didn't realize was that a neighbor had installed a security camera pointed directly at the street. The footage captured her trespassing, her face illuminated in the harsh beam of her flashlight, binder tucked under her arm like a badge of authority. When the footage surfaced, it spread like wildfire among the neighbors. The next morning, phones buzzed as clips of Karen sneaking onto the Parkers' property circulated in group chats and emails. What had once been whispers of her obsession had become undeniable proof. And the reaction was swift. The HOA called for another emergency meeting, this time not to hear complaints, but to decide Karen's fate within the community. The air was heavy with anticipation as residents filed in, the atmosphere more charged than ever before. Karen arrived clutching her binder, though it seemed lighter now, its once threatening presence diminished by the weight of her public disgrace. As the meeting unfolded, neighbors voiced their outrage. Trespassing wasn't just petty harassment, it was a violation of safety, a breach of trust, and a threat to the sense of security everyone cherished in Oakwood Hills. Families who had once avoided confrontation now stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their demand for accountability. The board listened carefully, their frustration evident. They reviewed the footage, the stack of harassment reports, and the long trail of complaints that had consumed their time for months. The conclusion was clear. Karen had gone too far, but before the board could finalize its decision, Karen erupted. She stood abruptly, binder slamming onto the table, her voice rising with a mixture of desperation and fury. She accused the Parkers of orchestrating a smear campaign, accused the board of betrayal, and accused the entire neighborhood of conspiring against her. Her words tumbled out in a torrent, but instead of commanding attention, they exposed her unraveling state. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking their heads, others turning away in discomfort. The image of Karen as a strict, rule-abiding neighbor had been shattered. In its place stood a woman consumed by bitterness, grasping at power that had already slipped through her fingers. The board called for order, but Karen stormed out before the meeting could conclude. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, the sound of a retreat that felt more like a declaration of war. In the days that followed, Karen's behavior grew erratic. She left notes in mailboxes warning neighbors of dangers they didn't believe. She paced her front yard at odd hours, binder clutched tightly to her chest as if it still held authority. She called the HOA office daily, her voicemails rambling and incoherent, alternating between threats and pleas for understanding. For the Parkers, life remained uneasy. Their pool, though still a place of joy, was clouded by the knowledge that Karen was watching, waiting, and plotting. They tried to shield their children from the drama, but even the youngest sensed the tension. The laughter that once rang freely now carried a cautious edge. Yet despite her escalating desperation, Karen's influence was gone. The community had united, the HOA had turned against her, and the truth of her motives was known. What remained was a woman clinging to control that no longer existed, but Karen wasn't finished, not yet. In her mind, she had one final chance to reclaim her power, one last move that would force the neighborhood to see her as the authority she believed she was. And as the summer drew to a close, she prepared to make that move, regardless of the cost. The question was no longer whether Karen would stop. It was how far she would go before the neighborhood stopped her. By late August, Oakwood Hills felt like a neighborhood divided by storm clouds. On one side was the growing unity of the residents, who had found common ground in their frustration with Karen. On the other hand was Karen herself, isolated and embittered, clinging to the last shreds of control she believed she still had. The once pristine image she had carefully crafted was in ruins. She was no longer the feared enforcer of rules, no longer the voice that demanded order at every board meeting. Instead, she was a spectacle someone whispered about behind closed doors, pointed at through half-closed blinds, and avoided on the sidewalk. She once patrolled with authority, but Karen's pride was stronger than her sense of reality. She convinced herself that the only reason the community had turned on her was that she hadn't pushed hard enough. To her, the binder wasn't just a collection of complaints, it was a symbol of her mission. And if the HOA wouldn't listen, she would take her crusade beyond them. Her final plan began quietly. She drafted a sprawling packet of documents, thicker than anything she had ever presented before. It contained every photograph she had ever taken of the Parkers' backyard, every note she had scribbled about noise, every citation she had tried to push through, and every letter she had mailed to city departments. At the center of it all was her demand. The Parkers' pool must be shut down permanently. Karen didn't just send this packet to the HOA. She mailed copies to the city council, the zoning commission, the county health department, and even local news outlets. She believed that if she could amplify her complaints beyond Oakwood Hills, anyone would finally validate her obsession. For days, she waited, pacing her front porch, binder clutched against her chest, eyes fixed on the mail truck. She imagined reporters swarming the cul-de-sac, cameras pointed at the Parkers' pool, vindicating every claim she had ever made. She fantasized about city officials arriving with orders to fill in the pool, proving once and for all that she had been right, but reality didn't align with her fantasies. The city dismissed her claims, noting that the Parkers had complied with every permit and inspection requirement. The health department ignored her, recognizing her complaints as repetitive and baseless. The zoning commission responded with a single-page letter stating there was no violation. Even the local news outlets, accustomed to sifting through dramatic tips, passed on her story. Karen's grand packet had landed with a thud, yet instead of accepting defeat, she grew more desperate. The rejection only fueled her conviction that a conspiracy was at play, that the HOA, the city, and even her neighbors were working together against her. In her mind, she wasn't the villain of Oakwood Hills. She was the lone truth-teller, betrayed by the very community she had tried to protect. The breaking point came when the Parkers announced their end-of-summer pool party. It wasn't just another gathering, it was a celebration of survival, a declaration that despite everything, their joy couldn't be destroyed. Invitations spread across the neighborhood, and nearly every family signed on. For once, the cul-de-sac buzzed with anticipation, united not by frustration but by excitement. Karen, watching from her window, saw the flyers being handed out, saw the children skipping with glee at the promise of one last summer bash. And something inside her snapped. If she couldn't stop the pool through rules, regulations, or complaints, she would stop it herself. In the days leading up to the party, she hatched her most reckless plan. She stocked up on noise meters, intending to measure every laugh and splash. Convinced she could build an airtight case of disturbance, she purchased industrial-strength floodlights, determined to shine them across the Parkers' yard to disrupt the gathering. And worst of all, she began drafting threats letters she intended to slip into neighbors' mailboxes, warning of legal consequences if they dared to attend. The night before the party, Karen was seen skulking across lawns, dropping her letters in the shadows. But this time, she wasn't unseen. Multiple neighbors caught glimpses of her darting between mailboxes, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. By morning, nearly every household had found one of her menacing notes tucked into their mail. Instead of intimidation, however, her efforts had the opposite effect. The neighbors were outraged. Parents who had once avoided conflict now spoke openly of filing restraining orders. Families who had tolerated her antics now vowed to confront her head-on. And the HOA board, weary of her escalating behavior, called for a final vote, Karen's removal from the HOA. But Karen didn't know this yet. On the day of the Parkers' party, she stood at her window, eyes fixed on the backyard across the street. She watched as balloons swayed in the breeze, as children splashed in the sparkling water, as music floated through the summer air. Her hands trembled with rage as she clutched her binder, now swollen to the point of bursting, filled with every scrap of her obsession. This wasn't just a pool party anymore. To her, it was a public humiliation, a reminder that she had failed. And failure was something Karen simply couldn't accept. As the laughter grew louder and the evening sun dipped lower, she made her move. Binder in hand, floodlights ready, she stepped out of her house, preparing to unleash her final gambit. The neighborhood she once controlled was about to see just how far she was willing to go to reclaim her power. She didn't realize was that they were ready for her. The day of the Parkers' end-of-summer pool party arrived with a kind of brilliance that made Oakwood Hills look like it belonged on a postcard. The lawns were neatly trimmed, the air was filled with the faint scent of grilled food, and laughter floated easily between houses. Families gathered in clusters, children ran with towels draped over their shoulders, and the sparkling pool became a magnet for joy. It was a scene of unity, a neighborhood reclaiming what had been stolen from them over months of bitterness and conflict. But Karen saw none of the joy. From her perch behind half-drawn blinds, she watched the celebration unfold with a tight grip on her binder. Her heart pounded with indignation. Every balloon tied to the Parkers' fence, every splash in the pool, every smile on the faces of her neighbors felt like a direct insult. They weren't just ignoring her warnings. They were mocking her authority. And for Karen, this was the final straw. As dusk settled over the neighborhood and the party grew livelier, she put her plan into motion. She dragged her industrial floodlights into position on her lawn, angling them toward the Parkers' backyard. When she flipped the switch, beams of harsh white light pierced the night, cutting across the pool and blinding the party-goers. The laughter faltered, the music paused, and all eyes turned toward Karen's yard. But Karen wasn't finished. She stormed across the street, binder tucked under one arm, noise meter in the other. She held it high like a badge of legitimacy, waving it toward the crowd as if the blinking numbers were proof of their crimes. She shouted about violations, about disturbances, about rules that no one else seemed to care about anymore. The party didn't scatter, though. Instead, it swelled with resistance. Neighbors who had once kept quiet now stood tall, their patience gone. Parents shielded their children from the blinding lights while others recorded Karen's outburst on their phones. The HOA board members, who had attended in solidarity, stepped forward to confront the scene, and then came the moment that sealed Karen's fate. One of the board members raised a hand and called for attention, announcing to everyone present that a vote had already been taken earlier that day. The decision was unanimous. Karen was officially removed from the HOA. Effective immediately, she had no standing, no influence, and no authority within Oakwood Hills. Every complaint she had filed, every demand she had made, every ounce of control she had clung to, it was all gone. The declaration hit her harder than any fine or reprimand ever could. For years, the HOA had been her weapon, her shield, and her identity. Without it, she was just another resident, stripped of the power she had used to torment her neighbors. The binder in her arms, once her symbol of authority, now looked pitifully small in the face of the community's unified defiance. As the news sank in, murmurs of relief rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors clapped, others hugged, and children resumed their laughter, unafraid of Karen's presence for the first time in months. The Parkers, though still cautious, stood at the center of it all, their pool now a symbol of victory, no longer a battleground. Karen, however, couldn't accept the reality. She screamed about conspiracies, about betrayal, about the injustice of it all. She tried to wave her binder as if it still held weight, but the crowd didn't flinch. Phones continued recording, neighbors turned their backs, and the board members calmly escorted her away from the Parkers' yard. Her once commanding presence had been reduced to a spectacle, a cautionary tale in real time. By the end of the night, the floodlights on her lawn had been unplugged, the binder clutched limply in her arms, and the street filled once more with the sounds of joy. For the first time in months, the Parkers and their neighbors celebrated without fear of interruption. The HOA, long burdened by Karen's obsession, finally exhaled. The fallout came swiftly. With her removal from the HOA, Karen lost her influence over community affairs. The harassment reports filed by her neighbors moved forward, leading to official warnings from local authorities. Her binder of complaints, once thick with scribbled notes and photographs, became useless, no more than a stack of papers documenting her obsession. The neighborhood moved on quickly. The Parkers' pool became a gathering place again, the laughter of children filling the air long after summer ended. The HOA resumed its normal duties, focusing on improvements that had been stalled for months. And the residents, once fractured by Karen's divisiveness, found strength in their unity. Karen, meanwhile, retreated further into isolation. Her blinds stayed closed, her lawn grew unkempt, and the woman who had once patrolled Oakwood Hills like a self-appointed sheriff became a ghost in her own community. Neighbors passed her house without acknowledging her, their silence a reflection of the power she had squandered. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She had tried to destroy the Parkers' joy, but in the end, she had destroyed only herself. Her desperate attempts to control the neighborhood had backfired so completely that she had lost everything she once valued. Her influence, her reputation, and the fear she inspired. The Parkers, though relieved, never gloated. Their victory wasn't just personal, it was collective. The downfall of Karen had restored balance to Oakwood Hills, reminding everyone that one person's obsession could never overpower a united community. Their pool, once a symbol of conflict, now stood as a reminder of resilience. And so, as summer gave way to autumn and the cool winds replaced the heat of August, the neighborhood found peace again. The laughter returned, the trust between neighbors was rebuilt, and the HOA, free from Karen's grip, began a new chapter of cooperation. Karen had tried to shut down a pool party, but in doing so, she had revealed her true self to everyone around her. And once the truth was exposed, there was no going back. She had lost the battle, the war, and the very identity she had built for herself. And Oakwood Hills would never look at her the same way again.